All right, so it should move to the next slide. Why doesn't it move to? Ah, there we go. Okay, we're good. Okay, so I took the opportunity, since we're talking about inequality, to think back about some of the books I've been writing about economic inequality in Canada. Goes back quite a long ways, actually. Uh, and 1981 was my first book on economic inequality in Canada. 2018 was the age of increasing inequality. And last year, 2024, the Scandalous Rise of Inequality in Canada. Three different books, all on the same basic topic. So why write three of them? Well, what's changed? What's new? What's different? What's perhaps more obvious than it was in the past? And in particular, what's now scandalous about economic inequality in Canada? And so, if I look at these three books, well, one of the things about writing about economic inequality in Canada back in 1981 is that you could pretty much summarize the field internationally in a couple hundred pages. One of the things that's happened over the last in this area, as in other areas in economics, is just the explosion of literature, explosion of both theory and empirical findings on economic inequality. And it was also, you're also writing at a particular time. It was kind of the end or the ending point of the Keynesian consensus on economic policy. And so the bottom line of that book was that economic inequality had remained relatively constant in Canada since the Second World War, roughly, not exactly, but roughly, because it was constant in the sense that different parts of the income distribution, the poor, rich, middle class, were all getting roughly constant shares of an increasingly large pie, a pie that was growing over time. But looked like it was kind of coming to an end, that period of Keynesian growth and Keynesian consensus, because 1981 was a recession year in Canada. So the book ended with a question: is growth necessary for the toleration of economic inequality? What happens if we have a slowing of growth? Does that produce pressure for change in existing economic institutions? So summarized the state of the international literature on economic inequality up to that point, 1981, but ended with the question: well, there are kind of two different kind of possibilities. That maybe if growth slows, maybe one possibility is that the existing members of the economic elite kind of consolidate their positions, economic inequality increases, and repression smothers political discontent. Possibility two is that political pressures force a greater attention to equality of opportunity and equality of result. It was kind of the question, is Canada going to trend towards a Latin American kind of model or a Scandinavian kind of model in the longer term future? So those are the lessons I took from that trend. What were the lessons that other people took? One of the lessons in the literature at the time was that studying inequality was about as interesting as watching grass grow. Hank Aaron made that comment. Now, I thought at the time, and I still think, that having stable income shares was interesting, because it was a historic bargain of political economy. A stable arrangement of political and economic forces in a capitalist economy and society. But other people took different lessons. And I think it's fair to say that most of the economics profession kind of started to take stable income shares for granted. In neoclassical economics, the stability of income shares in the 60s and the 70s produced kind of a paradigm shift. Because if nothing much has been happening on income distribution and inequality, well, perhaps we can talk about representative agents. Maybe steady state macro growth should be the focus. Up to then, in the 60s and 70s, there'd been a lot of discussion of, the pressures for distributional change, the potential instability of the capitalist system. But neoliberal macro, in neoliberal macroeconomics, suddenly social and political stability kind of morphed into, it used to be in the Keynesian world, it was the major focus, the major objective of economic policy. In the neoclassical world of steady state macro, social and political stability became kind of a casual assumption, a ceteris paribus kind of thing. You assumed away poverty and inequality when there's only a macro, a representative agent to talk about. So these things just drop off the agenda. And in the Keynesian consensus, that had been the major objective of economic policy, maintaining social and political stability, because that Keynesian consensus was driven by the memories of the Great Depression, of the growth of fascism and Nazism that came out of the Great Depression, and the wars of the Holocaust that came out of those totalitarian regimes. So there's a lot of emphasis in the 1950s and the 60s on the importance of full employment and a fair sharing of the gains from growth, and some expansion of the welfare state to give working people a little bit of a taste of economic security. But that kind of got lost in the transition into steady state macroeconomics. Now, of course, the Keynesian consensus did succeed in producing a long period of economic growth in per capita income. The real GDP in Canada had a remarkably long run of increase from the 1940s up to the present day. Growth phase during the Keynesian consensus, or can we see that here? Here we are. Can you see the pointer there? That was the phase of the Keynesian consensus, came to an abrupt halt in 1981 when the first big bump in economic inequality in Canada started to occur. There was a recovery in the late 80s, and then a big and long recession during the 1990s. But you're still seeing a substantial increase over the per capita incomes of the late 1940s. This is 1961. Now, I also like to sometimes go back to a longer run phase of things. But the neoliberal period in Canada really dates from this long period of time here. This period up at the top, more recent times, there's the COVID collapse and the bounce back. But the period since the financial crisis of 2009, 2010, kind of a period of zombie neoliberalism, I would call it, because not a lot of economic growth in per capita income to be shared around the economy. I think there's some point also in taking an even longer perspective on economic growth in Canada, because if we're talking about income inequality, it's important to think about what there is to be shared. The This is a graphic that's taken from Finances of the Nation, which is an outfit at U of T. And it goes back to Confederation in 1867. And it's a way of illustrating the fact that, back in the 1860s, 1870s, Canada was a pretty poor country. Basically, an average level of per capita GDP, kind of comparable to India to today, but not much movement for a number of years. And then the wheat boom really increased incomes going into the 1909, 1911 period. After that, a long period of ups and downs. Economic growth was a sometimes thing for basically the best part of 30 years, including the Great Depression. And so when we think about economic growth and the results of it, one thing we don't want to be assuming that it's a natural tendency of capitalist economies to produce economic growth over time. The surge in economic growth in Canada came during the Second World War and during the Keynesian consensus following that. The neoliberal agenda dominated the 1980s and thereafter. But the Keynesian consensus was this period of long and quite rapid growth during the 1950s and 1960s. And the point about talking about growth is that in this period, up to 1980, you could make the argument that inequality, a stable inequality, was the price that Canadian society paid for growth. That it was stable because there was similar growth at all percentiles of the income distribution. But that doesn't mean that Canadian society in the 1950s or 1960s was anything like an equal sort of society. The incomes of the top quintile of the income distribution were about 10 times larger than the bottom 20% of the income distribution. And so there was substantial economic inequality in Canada in the 50s and 60s, but at least it was stable. And so the argument could be made and was made that inequality and the incentives that inequality creates was a necessary for growth. The price that Canadian society had paid. But that rationale for economic inequality came to a crashing end somewhere around the early 1980s. Because the long run, this graphic presents the long run it's basically labor compensation per hour worked in Canada, going back to 1914, I believe. Splices together two statistical series in around here. And it's a comprehensive measure of the benefits to labor, including the value of fringe benefits. You can see a strong period, a long period of increasing average wages through here. And that's socially important because when average wages have increased for a long time, the social expectation is that your kids are going to be better off than you are, and you're better off than your parents were, and you're better off now than you were 20 years ago. So it's an expectation, a positive expectation, both for individuals and for their children and grandchildren. And it was a pretty strong period of growth in labor compensation per hour up until approximately the early 1980s. And after that, we had a long period till the year 2000, basically a stagnancy of labor compensation per hour. And that's the kind of the big switch that we saw in income distribution. Wait, I want to go this way here. So here we are. Because since the early 1980s, now I'm seeing the screens that are in front of me. I'm hoping that everybody is also seeing a slide whose title is "Since the early 1980s, income growth has been much faster" at the very top. Is this what everybody is seeing? Hello? That's what
Sorry, I was just trying to unmute the mic there. Yep, we can see it.
Okay, now, and because that's one of the problems with talking to your computer screen is you don't actually know whether other people are actually, what other people are actually seeing. So, and you can see my little pointer here that is going to point to the data here and compare the average real income in 1982 and 40 years later of the top 1/10 of 1%, of the next 9/10 of the top 1%, the people between 95th and 99th percentile, people who are at the bottom of the top decile, and the people who are in the rest of the top half of the income distribution. And all this is trying to do is show how very unequally the gains in income have been at different points in the income distribution. The table goes into it in more depth, looking at people at the top 1% of the top 1%, and the top 1/10 of 1% and the top 1%, and economists tend to think of things in terms of ratios, and most inequality measures are calculated in terms of ratio. People on the street, it's often more convincing to think in terms of absolute dollars. This is all measured in 2022 dollars. But whatever way you think about it in terms of ratios or in terms of absolute dollars, at the very top, you're getting annual income gains of over 100,000 a year. At the middle of the distribution, you're getting annual income gains of like $225. At the 90th percentile, that's a little bit higher, $600 a year. At the 99th percentile, like $3,000 a year average increase over this 40-year period. But the farther you go up in the income distribution, the faster are, in both absolute and relative terms, is the increase in income. So the basic picture since the 1980s is a very rapid income growth at the very top, kind of stagnant down here at the 75th and the median and the 25th percentile. And when that happens, we get, the thing about inequality, inequality stays stable over time if income growth rates are similar at all points in the income distribution. Inequality increases over time if income growth rates are higher at the top of the income distribution. And that's what's basically driven income distribution in Canada for the last roughly 40 years, since around 1980. And so then the next point, of course, is why does rising inequality matter? And then that was the subject of the 2018 book. And the basic answer, why does it matter? Well, because economic inequality is important in itself. it's important in different ways at the top and at the middle and at the bottom of the income distribution. I mean, if there's a lot of growth in incomes at the top end, and by like 100,000 a year, and very little in the rest of the income distribution. So the top end is kind of pulling away from the rest of society. There's bound to be just a growing disconnect between the economic elite and the rest of society. If you're widening income gaps in the middle of the income distribution, you undermine the common shared experiences of Canadians and their sense of community. If there are greater gaps between the middle class and the poor, well, since 1948, Canada has signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says, for example, that housing is a basic human right. We have tent cities all over this country now that show that Canada signs these treaties, but we don't actually do anything very much to deliver on them. So the basic human rights of the disadvantaged are denied when there's so little income going to the bottom of the income distribution. So income inequality is important in itself, but it's also important in a macroeconomic sense, because increasing in unbalanced growth and increasing inequality in income shares produces increasing debt fragility and rising debt levels among the middle class, and increasing fragility and increasing financial instability, which has costs in macroeconomic instability, and it tends to increase inequality of opportunity, which has major implications throughout society. But one of the things that this book ended up really kind of focusing on a bit more is that when we have rising inequality, increasing inequality over time, you undermine any sense of social cohesion the society has. And we have individual problems. All of us have individual problems, but we also have common problems. Climate change is a massive common problem for Canadian society. The pandemic was a massive common problem for Canadian society. And those sorts of common problems, societal problems, require a common solution. They are vastly different timescales. The pandemic unfolded in a period of like weeks. Climate change is something that's happened over decades and centuries. But in both cases, there's a core externality problem. If you burn carbon-based fuels, you increase you provide a direct externality impact on climate change for everybody else. If you spread the virus, then you also affect everybody else's outcomes. And so there's a core problem of how do we deal with those externalities and those common existential threats, which require some level of social cohesion and political stability to select and implement the solution. So economic inequality is important in itself, and also because of the problems and solutions it prevents. So you might ask yourself, well, why do I think that there's a big shift around 1980? Well, one sign of that shift was the macro regime shift in unemployment. We've been measuring unemployment in Canada in essentially the same way since the end of the Second World War. It's quite a comparable measure. And if we look at the 10-year period, from after the Second World War, unemployment in Canada was under 4% most years. It increased in the 60s and up to the 70s. But for the entire 30-year period, 1946 to 75, there was one period of monetary policy adventurism. The governor of the Bank of Canada at the time, it was called the Coin Affair, that pushed unemployment above 6%. But overall, even including that, the unemployment rate averaged something like 4.7% for basically 30 years in Canada, and prices were stable for most of that time as well. From 1980 to 1990, unemployment in Canada averaged 9.5%, and it's only come down somewhat in the periods since 2000 to 7%. And this is a context. Now, obviously, the Canadian economy is a very different beast in 2025 than it was in 1946. But most of the changes that we've observed should have pushed unemployment down, not up. There's much less, from both the demand side and the supply side. There's much less seasonality of employment. We have internet job search and long distance commuting and online working. So location isn't nearly as important as it used to be. More people live in cities where there are lots of, the labor markets are much more efficient. We have new institutions like the gig economy. We certainly have an increased unemployment insurance. Just over only like a third of the unemployed in Canada today get regular EI benefits. And so that from the supply side and the demand, and more fundamentally, the labor market is now much more composed of low unemployment type people. It's much older and much better educated than it used to be. So even if you just take those shift share analysis, it should be like 2.5 percentage points lower than it was back in the 1950s, and then that was in 2022 or so. So we've shifted to a high unemployment economy. Now, if you only look at CanSim, what do you see? You see, oh, look at this. If you only, CanSim only starts in 1977, and so you don't actually get to see the lower unemployment rate of the 1950s and the 60s and the early 70s. You're only looking at this part of the diagram. And so we've become habituated to the idea of high unemployment in Canada. In fact, the 2024 budget document referred to unemployment being at historic lows in Canada at 6%, trending up and trending up strongly. And I'm going to argue, come back to this at the end, because it makes a world of difference to inequality trends, whether it's jobs chasing people in a labor shortage economy or people chasing jobs in a labor surplus economy. And Canada has been, by policy design, a labor surplus economy for quite a long time. And it's been built into people's expectations, certainly from top to bottom of the income distribution. But back in the days of the Keynesian consensus, when inequality was fairly stable, the way people talked about the issue of more inequality or less inequality, well, if inequality is stable in different countries, because there's an attempt being made to maintain full employment, and there's an attempt being made to maintain fair distribution of national income, there's still a question of, do some countries have more inequality than others? And what does that mean for social outcomes? Back in 1980 or the late 1970s, the issue was, for example, does the US have more inequality than Canada? And do the differences in inequality across countries, is that a menu of social choices? You know, is it fair to have more inequality or less inequality? And if we have more inequality, does that imply more crime, less poor health, less happiness, less social mobility? And there was a large literature, a very influential literature, which basically asked what are the implications of inequality, because the implicit question sitting behind it was, what sort of society would you like to live in? Would you like to live in a high inequality society or a low inequality society? Sort of, would you like to want to live in the US or in Scandinavia, for example? And what are the implications of the level of inequality that you have in those two very different countries? Now, that was that is an important question, and it was a plausible assumption back in the 60s and 70s that inequality was stable within and because you had relatively equal income growth parts of the income distribution. And it's an important question because if you compare OECD countries, and this is the Gini index of equivalent disposable income, you get quite a large range of inequality among countries, all of which compete in the same international marketplace, and all of which are relatively high income, market-oriented kinds of societies. And the importance of these sorts of statistics is one, that they show quite a range, and two, that they show that there is change from one year to the next in the level of inequality. And it shows that there are social choices to be made. Margaret Thatcher in the UK in the 1980s was famous for the expression "Tina." There is no alternative to her policies, but there most definitely are. At the top of the inequality by the Gini index are countries like the United States and Mexico and Chile. At the bottom are countries like Iceland, Norway, and Denmark. And those are big differences in the equality of life, of distribution of national income. But now a deeper question is, what about trends over time? More inequality very often now means increasing over time, because in countries like Australia or Canada or the US, we've had roughly 40 years of unbalanced growth in which inequality has been increasing. And that's been driven by this differential in growth rates, and the fact that incomes at the top have grown much more rapidly than incomes for everybody else. And so the new question really is, what sort of society are we becoming? And what are the implications of continually larger income differentials for society? And because as long as there's a difference in growth rates, we're going to see increasing income shares at the top. And so for that to turn around, there has to be some sort of slowing of top 1% income growth, or some sort of acceleration of bottom 99% income growth, or some combination of the two. But if we don't have some tendency to equally strong growth at different parts of the income distribution, we're going to have a continued differential in income growth rates and increasingly large gaps in income. And the clearest data for this comes from the US, and this is the top 1% share of pre-tax national income, and which diminished. It was fairly constant down to the 1970s, and has accelerated ever since, going up to 2022. Now, two important lessons can be taken from this sort of graphic. And one is that most of the action in income inequality has been at the very top of the income distribution. The second, and an equally important conceptual point, is that long-run growth in capitalist societies is not a stable process. We had a long period when the top 1% income share declined, and a more recent period in which the top 1% income share has increased. Now, this period of decline in top 1% income share should not be confused at all with the idea that incomes at the top actually decline. The real issue throughout this period was just that incomes at the top grew more slowly than incomes of the other 99%. Conversely, this period of rising income share at the top is not because their incomes went up, their incomes grew at the top much more rapidly than incomes at the bottom. It's the differential in income growth rates that drives these trends in shares. And most recently, we've seen in the US a very strong tendency for incomes to grow much more rapidly at the top than elsewhere. Now, to observe people at the very top of the income distribution, you can't depend on survey evidence, because you won't have nearly the sample size or the probability of response that you need to track what the trends at the very top. So you have to depend on income tax data, and that creates the problem of tax avoidance, and the extent to which tax avoidance blurs out the true trends in income distribution. So I've become less and less comfortable with presenting data on comparative international data comparing US and Canadian top-end income distribution trends, because there's methods of tax avoidance that are available in Canada that aren't available in the US. But even if we ignore those differences in data, underlying data, even if we work with the data that is available, and which understates the top end income trends in Canada, to the extent that income the tax avoidance mechanisms have increased in their use. Question is, well, here the red lines here represent actuals. The greens are trends. If you take that average rate of growth and extrapolate it off into the future, and so this takes us up to 2021, basically a 40-year period. And what it indicates is that this is for the middle of the top 1/10 of 1%. This is for the person at the borderline between the top 1% and the 99%. This is for the person that's in the middle of the income distribution. And when there isn't much growth in the middle of the income distribution, that kind of flatlines if you just to extend the trend. At the bottom of the top 1%, there's growth, but it's nothing like as big as at the middle of the top 1/10 of 1%. And what that implies is that there's increasing absolute dollar gaps from like measured in comparable dollars, from like 700,000 to like 2 million already. And if the trends continue, doubling again. But basically what's going on is you have much more rapid income growth on a much larger base. So the absolute increases increase over time. And what happens with that? Well, if you have increasingly extravagant elite consumption, that will spend all that income. But if you don't spend all that income, what happens to macroeconomic balance? You need some aggregate demand to absorb that increased income. Norms of luxury become increasingly distant. But if you've got it flaunted lifestyles, maybe they're resented. But since Veblen, many people have pointed out that conspicuous consumption and status gain is the main point of great wealth. The gaps increase and these income gaps will increase over time. So we're up to 717. So how much longer should I be talking?
Feel free to go on as long as you need, Professor.
Oh well, yeah, but that's. I want to have a little break and show you the next slide, and that is the Chateau de Rambouillet. This is one of the hunting lodges of the French the kings before the pre-revolutionary kings. Yeah, they have several scattered around the Paris area, in addition to Versailles. Those he liked to look at lakes, and water. So those are it's an artificial lake dug out by hand labor in the late 1700s. And this is his hunting lodge, which you visit occasionally. And those are quite exquisite statues looking out over the lake. And that speck of red is my wife, who's enjoying the view. And you could ask yourself, what is the I'm taking this picture, and what is the grandson of Norwegian peasants doing on the hunting lodge, the grounds of the hunting lodge of the French king? And of course, the answer is that the French had a revolution, that the extravagant lifestyles of the elite did recycle purchasing power and create jobs for many years, but eventually that process came to an end. It's a part of our culture that we have many sort of costume. Downton Abbey was a TV series from some years ago that talked about the upstairs, downstairs life of British nobility. But medieval Europe or Mughal India or pre-revolutionary France, they all were examples of economies with extravagant elite consumption, which recycled income to stabilized aggregate demand, created jobs for everybody, but had massively high consumption inequality. And it was stable. Those regimes lasted for centuries. Partly because, if something's in place long enough, it becomes socially accepted. It's the natural order of things. But partly also because it was strongly reinforced by the the sanctions of the church and the state, which lasted for quite a long time until of course, it didn't. And those deference norms that enabled societies to tolerate extreme inequality for many years have definitely been eroded by secularism and democratic ideas for at least the last 150 years, since the mid-1800s. So when we think of increasingly distant top incomes, well, they do imply bigger markets for the infrastructure of exclusivity. There's a separate world of suburbs and resorts and gated communities and such. As the top end becomes increasingly different in its lifestyle from everybody else, it becomes increasingly difficult for people to socialize across income groups, and so there's not a lot of social contact. There's separate worlds of lived reality at the very top of the income distribution and for everybody else. But it's worth asking ourselves, so what? Why should the 99% care? Why don't we just get on with our lives and ignore what's happening to the top 1%? What are in economic terms, what are the externalities of rapid income growth at the very top of the income distribution? Well, one is a loss of well-being. What used to be good enough no longer satisfies, and the fact the increasing financial fragility and anxiety that comes from macro and micro debt crises. If we take our consumption norms from the example of people who are just a little bit higher in the income distribution than we are, and we try to keep up with the Joneses, for a long time, if you had a balanced growth and income is growing at roughly the same rate, different parts of the income distribution, keeping up means that aspirations are growing at roughly the same rate of income as for most people in the income distribution. So there's certain discontent with how your incomes are going up, but people could keep up at least to a constant extent. The problem with unbalanced growth, when incomes grow so much more rapidly at the top than at the middle of the income distribution, is that middle class aspirations are ratcheting up at an escalating rate, but middle class incomes are stagnating. So the only way you can keep up with your increased aspirations is by going deeper and deeper into debt. Housing is a particular example. And those increasing debts, driven by attempting to keep up with the escalating consumption norms, produce a tendency to increase financial fragility and an ongoing anxiety about that. So a decline in well-being is an implication of unequal of increasing inequality. Now, I keep going in the wrong direction. Another part of that is that, well, pre-revolutionary France and Mughal India had stable inequality for a very long period of time, but they didn't have an advertising industry. And when more and more of income goes to the very top of the income distribution, that's a huge shift in market demand. It's a shift in income and potential purchasing power towards people who already have life's necessities. To get them to buy stuff, since they're considered, if income is increasingly going to the already affluent, then you have to create the desire for expenditure that isn't actually needed in any particular sense. So advertising becomes essential to motivate consumption. Advertising pushes materialism as a life purpose and happiness, but increasingly it's a kind of aspirational advertising. People end up paying thousands of dollars for Hermes handbags when they could perform the same function with stuff from Walmart. But a handbag from Walmart wouldn't show your status, wouldn't demonstrate your importance in the same way. And status goods are a pointless purchase if nobody else knows or thinks what you're buying is a special, desirable, or exclusive item. So it's essential for there to be ad spillover, so that because it's essential that the people who can buy status goods know that they're status goods, because they know that everybody else knows that it's a highly desirable item. So ever increasing inequality increases market incentives to market status goods, to manufacture envy. And the happiness implication is that increasing media saturation by ads for stuff that only the top 1% can afford, or even the top 1/10 of 1% can afford, reduces the well-being of everybody else. Declining social mobility is another implication of increasing inequality, because there's an increased drop from the top. If you're already at the top, the only possible social mobility is down, and that creates ever greater incentives for affluent parents, to prevent downward social mobility for their own children. When parents who are already at the top prevent downward social mobility for their children, that decreases the chances of upward mobility for the other 99% of society. So declining social mobility is an implication of increasing inequality. And of course, increasing inequality of political influence is a fourth implication of increasing inequality. Because although we might want to ignore the top 1%, they don't want to be ignored. Their political and social preferences are quite different. They're much more active politically than everybody else, and campaign funding depends heavily on their generosity. We'd only have to think about Elon Musk and his relationship with Donald Trump to show how much increasing inequality can affect. Of course, between elections, the ability of the affluent to fund think tanks and shape political discourse is important in a structural sense. And political influence is one of those things where more for the 1% implies less for the 99%. I'm going to go quickly now because I want to talk about what's different between 2024 and 2018. One thing that's different is that we have new data on wealth inequality. This recent book puts a lot more emphasis on wealth inequality and its implications than my previous books, in part because there's much more data available now on the inequality of wealth over time. A second important development is artificial intelligence. The International Monetary Fund estimates that something like 60% of jobs in developed economies will be affected by artificial intelligence. And that's going to have a big impact on labor income inequality. We don't know, it's hard to predict whether it's going to have a bigger impact on middle-class jobs than on truck driver kind of jobs. But either way, it's going to have a major impact on labor income inequality. That's a bit uncertain, but
sorry,
what is
Professor, I was just
certain,
going to we wanted to move on to a question period shortly because we're going to lose the room. I just wanted to know if you wouldn't mind sorry, I hate to say skip ahead to the conclusion, but I was hoping you might be able to share a little bit about some of the things we might be able to do.
All right. So I'm going to, I will then, I'll do this slide. I'll flash through a bunch of other slides and I'll go right to the conclusion. How about this slide?
All right, thank you.
Because one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that most of the discussion of the impact of artificial intelligence focuses on its impact on jobs. But for sure, we know that the owners of these algorithms will clearly win. And so one of the big implications of artificial intelligence is not just its impact on jobs, but on increased wealth inequality and the increase in the capital share of GDP, and therefore increase eventually in the importance of inheritance to the inequality. We also have, in recent years, a massive demonstration proof that rapid changes in inequality and poverty are possible. We saw that in 2021 when we turned on, within a matter of weeks, major transfer programs which had a large impact on inequality. And we also see currently the costs for human rights and liberal democracy of increasing inequality and insecurity in a very important way. This graphic, the important part of it is this dip right here, where the inequality in Canada dropped dramatically during COVID times, whereas transfer payments were rolled out, rose back up as soon as they were wound back. We can reduce inequality and we can reduce poverty dramatically quickly if the political will is there. The compensation of here's some data on the distribution of wealth. I won't spend a lot of time on it. Here's distribution data on the very top end of the wealth distribution. Here's but the basic, where is it? I want to go. And the basic problem that we've had is that everybody's focusing on labor income when we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion and the fair shares of GDP. What can be done about inequality in Canada? That's the conclusion. Here's the one slide we want. We can do something about the inheritance of massive wealth, massive inequality of wealth. When labor compensation is only about half of GDP, the ownership of capital passes in Canada from generation to generation without taxes. We haven't taxed inheritances in Canada since the 1970s, and it's high time that we tax inheritances. And so I suggest that we should tax inheritances, at least large inheritances, as income. I've emphasized already the importance of full employment for the incomes particularly of disadvantaged people. Making full employment a macro policy objective, I think, is number 2 on my list. Third basic policy is we have to worry about, when the robots make the robots that make all the stuff we need, where are the jobs actually going to be? The artificial intelligence is going to threaten middle-class jobs that thought they were safe, and so the impacts of technological change are massively important, and motivate the importance of a universal basic income for adults and an increase in the social wage that underpins well-being. Children and seniors already get some of it, but working age adults in Canada need more. Fourth basic policy, fairer taxes at the top, something closer to a marginal top tax rate of 65%. And if we have a focus on full employment and a focus on increasing minimum wages, we can increase the rate of productivity growth in Canada because we foreclose for employers the option of the low wage equilibrium that they've tried to implement for the last number of years. So this is way over time, but that, and I have many more slides, but that is about it. Well, there we go. What can be done? How about that?
All right. Thank you very much, Professor. I'm just going to open up the mic there. Yeah, so thank you for your presentation. Thank you to our Zoom audience. We're going to open up the floor to questions now. We do have a couple guests of honor, as I've been referring to them in the emails, who are our city council rep, our local professor, and our whistleblower. Mr. Crawford, I believe you have some questions loaded, so I figured I'd open it up to you first.
Well, thank you for the presentation. Very interesting.
I can't hear you.
Yeah, I have seen your presentation before. You did one in December. And I learned more from this one about tax. And you mentioned two things.
I'm not hearing it. I'm not hearing you at all.
Okay, my apologies. Then we will do, you will, okay, if whoever has a question, we will get you to physically come closer to the computer.
Yeah.
We'll get you to speak directly into the mic, and I'm making notes for next time to bring more auxiliary equipment.
You can even borrow some of it. Great. Yeah.
Yes, I did thank you for your presentation, and I do thank you for the one that you presented in December, which I saw earlier. I just want to catch up with a little more on the tax avoidance and evasion that you have alluded to, because it seems to me that when you look at the history and what is acceptable norm in bygone days, we have a movement these days where people do not feel as though there's any equality anywhere. And in fact, it goes quite demonstrably apparent when you look at what's happening in the USA, that the inequality crosses the board into the law and the judicial system. And I wondered if you would comment on that.
Well, I do think that around the world, we do observe different types of socio-political equilibrium. That there are countries where people do think that, well, we pay a lot of tax, but we get a lot of tax, and so taxation is accepted as something that's a socially responsible thing to do, because government is fairly efficient and delivers a lot of tangible benefits for individuals, and is well reputed to be honest. There are also societies that we observe where expectations of the public sphere are extremely low, so everybody thinks that everybody else is corrupt, and so you'd be a fool not to be corrupt yourself. So those two sets of outcomes are different in their the one you could call cooperative, the other you could call non-cooperative, and they're very different in their well-being implications. We want to move to the cooperative, what we could call cooperative equilibrium, where people recognize that there is there's a social responsibility to be paying taxes. You're pointing to the fragmentation of political discourse in the United States and the erosion of many of the trashing, the destruction of many of the norms that otherwise that used to maintain the stability of American society, and it is a shocking and going much faster down the road towards a very low level equilibrium than I would have thought likely even a few years ago. So it's a gloomy prognosis, but I do not think it's actually inevitable.
Okay, thank you.
Why American?
There's a question from the floor here. Does this apply to the Canadian justice system as well, being just as bad, if not worse, than the American system?
I think one of the things that I think I've observed over the last number of years is a greater colonization, I would say, of discourse in the periphery. We all now follow American politics with much greater intensity than ever used to be the case. The ups and downs of American society are much more salient to many people than the outcomes in their own city, their own province, or their own country. So it's not. One of the things we observe in international data is that there are very strong differences between countries, and the actual differences, and they may have maintained over many years. That doesn't obviously necessarily directly predict the future, but it certainly indicates that through a lot of the historical events, countries have remained different. So we can't. My bottom line is, we can't just start off by assuming that because it's happening in the States, it's going to happen here.
Thank you, Professor. Who would like to go next?
Could I just follow up on that?
Absolutely, Chris, come on up.
Well, I think that this was. Yeah, that means Canada's been doing pretty good. At the top, yes.
And I think that maybe if so we're just like a mouse living beside an elephant, and maybe that's why
I can't hear.
Oh, yeah.
Oh
Yeah, sorry. Please, when you're ready for your question, Chris.
yes, so when you were talking about the legal system and inequality, I'm just trying to connect everything, and just to get an understanding of how this inequality, okay, let me try and piece it together. How our legal system makes things unequal here in Canada. How would you tie the two?
Well,
You see, what I'm getting at is
our legal system includes tax law. It includes the law around transfer payments. Those to me really are the big drivers of the flow of material resources directly, and there's things that can be changed fairly quickly. So tax policy and the provisions of an adequate social income, adequate social insurance, and an adequate social wage are really crucial. That's a slightly different question from the wider implications of the legal system for criminal justice outcomes or for political participation. But the legal system has many implications.
Right. But getting back to like the economics, yes. Canada at one time, 2008, really pops up in one's mind. Okay, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and these security-backed mortgages that the United States, if we are to go back to the USA and how we are a mouse living beside an elephant, how that gradually affected us. I think at one time our debt was at, let's say, $500 billion, which was not much. I think our previous governments did quite well. Like, you know, if we were to look at Mulroney, and then when we went from Mulroney to Chrétien and Paul Martin, we had some pretty good politicians there doing some pretty good things for this country, I would say. I think that maybe, I don't know if they were following that Keynesian, right? The invisible hand versus the visible hand. I guess Adam Smith, the invisible hand, Keynesian being the visible hand. I think that the policies that we were following may have been a balance of the two, but after a certain time when we changed, I'm not going to mention any names or anything like that because I'm not going to make it political, but we sort of tended towards the visible hand. Now our debt is close to $2 trillion.
Well, I'm not so sure that we want to avoid mentioning politics.
Well, would you put the blame on the 1%, or would you put the blame on? Is it the 1% that is to blame?
Well,
or is it the system? Thank you.
I mean,
Miscommunication,
the
different
two
levels of
interact.
government.
And of course, the 1% are part of the system, and really, I'm not. I would focus much more narrowly than really the top 1%. I mean, the top half of 1% is people who have net worth of more than 10 million in Canada in about 2020. But so that it's that top 1% who can be influenced in one direction or another by politicians. Politicians have some degree of freedom, and you know, we had politicians in Canada in the early 2000s, for example, who believed that Canada was going to become an energy superpower by developing the Alberta oil sands. They persuaded 200 billion people. They persuaded major corporations to invest over $200 billion in the Alberta oil sands, and many thousands of Canadians to hitch their personal fortunes to that agenda. That's a massive impediment to realistic climate change policy today, because we have massive sunk costs that are preventing anything being done to rectify our greenhouse gas emissions. So that's an example of how politicians and interest groups have interacted to really stymie what I would call the desirable political desirable policy changes. And that comes back to the Harper.
So you don't
government.
think it was
That's
the
what they
economic
did.
policies that were the change, that is, that from previous governments to, let's say, you don't think that wasn't an effect at all, didn't affect
I didn't quite hear.
country? Sorry?
I didn't hear.
So shall I move?
Yeah, actually,
Sorry.
we're gonna
Sorry.
move on to the next
Yeah.
question. Thank you very much, Professor. Anybody else like to add their say? Mhm. No, please feel free. I might get you to yeah. Or if we have any questions from the Zoom audience as well, please feel free to chime in now. I'll take that as a no. So Elizabeth, please feel free.
Hi there. I might be steering us a little off topic. This has been a really great chat specifically about income inequality. My mind from a city level goes as well towards I'm curious about how some of these numbers, some of the background and the solutions can apply across demographics when you apply more of an intersectional lens. Looking at inequality, not just in like income quintiles or percentiles, but how that looks across demographics, ethnic groups, regional portions of the country as well. Do you have any supplementary information or anything you can speak to there that might give a little bit more of a layered insight into how that looks as well?
One of the fascinations and the problems in talking about economic inequality is that it has so many dimensions. There are over 40 million Canadians right now, and we differ on many different dimensions, both now and in the future. And we try to summarize all those differences in the one word, inequality, right? So when you talk about intersectionality and the many possible different slices of the pie, then and the different dimensionalities to it in an urban context, the list can go on and on and on.
Of course.
If I'm going to focus particularly on say an issue that it was raised in the last federal budget, the last budget of what was then the Trudeau government focused on the idea of generational fairness, and was really focusing on the problem that many under 35, under 40 people have, that the life vision of the good job and buying the house and the sort of secure middle class lifestyle just doesn't seem to be something that's within reach for many people. And so that saw the problem of inequality through a generational lens as much as anything else. Now, I'm always a little cautious about that because there are 25-year-old billionaires as well as 25-year-old homeless people. The differences within or among people of the same age are far, far greater than the differences between people of slightly different ages. And the two are of course come back to things like social policy, housing policy, which can affect very dramatic. I mean, right now in Toronto, some people live in penthouses and some people live in tents, right? We don't have in Canada an emphasis on the basic human rights of all Canadians, which would recognize the fact that you know, political and social rights are meaningless if you don't have a basic economic level of well-being. The homeless have no the homeless have no rights in many important ways that the housed think of as just normal life. So we can't really focus, we can't really get at the generational inequalities unless that we get at the inequalities within generations. If that's at all a coherent type of analysis. And I think that part of the cost of focusing on, for example, particular groups within the disadvantaged is that when you focus just on the disadvantaged, say of racially identifiable people, the disadvantaged who are not racially different don't see themselves reflected in political discourse and become resentful of resources that are devoted to other people's problems when their problems are arguably just as severe. So I think we have to be a bit careful in the way that the language we use of language of intersectionality we use to make sure that everybody who is disadvantaged can see themselves in the discourse and don't feel themselves to be excluded by the discourse. Which comes back to you asked a very big question, so
Oh, I'm
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I was just curious if you, again, because we were looking at this all really from one layer of just income inequality, I was just curious if there was any.
Oh, well, the income inequality, many things are not in income inequality. Income is a component of well-being, but say that your commuting time, the size of the place that you get to live, that's not measured in money income. The social wage, whether childcare is available for your kids, whether you can enjoy a public park free of charge. Those are big components of well-being and of the inequality of well-being, but they're not measured in money income. So that's why at the bottom end of this thing, I had this, it's still there. Here it is, the social wage. Inequality, the importance of inequality in money income decreases to the extent that people can rely on the social wage of public services, beautiful parks, public concerts, relatively inexpensive public transportation, healthcare and education, those services that are delivered at small or no money cost. The availability of that social wage is massively important for the equality of well-being, precisely because it makes the inequality of money income less important.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. If we have any final questions, oh, we got a wave?
Yeah.
All right. Do you think we have time for one question?
We can talk about one more.
I'm okay. I don't have anything super burning. I don't really have a burning question. But you reminded me that I have one of your books sitting in my stack of things to read. So I will get to that. I'm teaching economics here at the university. But yeah, great presentation. Like being born in 1982 and graduated from undergrad in economics in 2008. And now I'm 42 and a part-time professor and PhD student who's like PhD got derailed by the pandemic and like will never own a home. I feel like you told my life story today, so thank you for that.
And you have never experienced Canada with a decent social safety net.
No, so I'm trying to finish my PhD so I can build that, but it's hard.
Back in the 70s and the 80s, something like 80% of the unemployed could get what was then called unemployment insurance benefits. Most recent numbers are like 33%.
Yeah, it's rough.
Alrighty, well, I'm just gonna quickly give my thanks. Thank you very much, Professor Osberg. It's been a real treat to have you. You are our first special guest for the newly formed Young Scholars Initiative Toronto Hub, so thank you very much. How about a round of applause for our speaker, everyone?
And let me put in a plug for my next book that comes out with the University of Toronto Press in September. I'm doing the copy edits right now. The working title is Not Fair: Inequality of Opportunity in Canada.
All right. You heard it here first, folks. Not Fair, the next book by Professor Lars Osberg, coming out, you said, sorry, in September, you think?
That's September. That's what they promised me.
Nice. All right.
Great, thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. We will adjourn the meeting. You have yourself a wonderful night, Professor, and everybody joining us on Zoom. Thank you very much for joining us. Please feel free, if you have any follow-up questions, you can add them to our email thread, and then I can see if Professor might have time to answer a few more in post. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thanks for having me.